American history is really defined by waves of immigration. And when we talk about Italian American immigration, we talk about it has been going on for a lot of time, but we really talk about those peak years of immigration. In Columbus, there are records of some Italian Americans here as early as the 1850s, but it was maybe 20 of them. I mean, it was a handful. The peak years of immigration really began in the 1880s. With about 300,000 Italian immigrants. That doubled to about 600,000 in the 1890s. And then it really exploded from there, from 1900 to 1920. By 1920, there were 4 million Italian immigrants in the country. So it never stopped, but because of changes in immigration law in the 1940s, which was really part of a backlash against the immigration that was taking place, numbers were reduced. They were never eliminated, but the numbers went down substantially. So for most historians and people looking at waves of immigration, the Italian American really is squarely from 1880 to about 1920 as those peak years.
Well, and the attraction of a place like Ohio was that it was a major industrial state by the late 19th century. Jobs were plentiful, and a lot of the people who arrived from Italy didn't come with big skill sets. Many were from rural areas, probably had worked in farming and that sort of thing. And industrial jobs were pretty good paying compared to what they knew back home.
They were jobs that you could have without necessarily speaking the language. If you were hardworking and were willing to actually be flexible about what you did, there was a huge amount of opportunity. And that time period that we're talking about, 1880 to 1920, that was a period of rapid industrialization in this country. And there was a need for jobs. There was a need for immigrants. So it was a convergence of the need being there and the opportunities and people willing to take them. During that period, most of the immigration really came from the southern half of Italy, which was largely agricultural. Even today is still largely agricultural, definitely poorer than the northern, more industrialized city areas of Italy. So it makes sense. It's the classic immigration story that continues today. It's opportunity, it's freedom, it's the ability to have a say in your destiny if you work hard and if you have a family that you're trying to protect or provide for. There was a huge incentive for people to come and work hard and become a part of this country.
Well, and your family is an example.
My great-grandparents on my mother's side came in the 1880s, and my father, as a 7-year-old, arrived in 1927. So they absolutely spanned that entire period.
As most families, it was economic. The immigrants from Italy were southern Italy and Sicily, because those were the poor areas. And it's rare that you're going to find somebody from Genoa or Tuscany or Venice that immigrated to the United States because they had jobs and money. And so my family was poor, like almost everybody I know, their family was poor. And my great-grandfather came in 1899 because he had, as the years go on, it gets a little lost, but if it was a friend or a cousin, and we're not sure, and said, come, this is great, Columbus, Ohio, spectacular. And I can't imagine that in 1899. And they came over, and his friends started him. There was a West Market on Gift Street, which is now the Bottoms. And I don't even know if the building still exists. But it was the West Market. We have the Central Market, North Market, West Market. And I think there was a Mohawk Market at one time. And so they... He got established with a fruit and vegetable retail stand, and then he bought a horse and wagon and started wholesaling. So that's how the family got involved in the wholesale business. He left his wife and 2 sons in Sicily, and it took, I think, 6 years for him to bring his family here. And my grandfather was the oldest son. And his name was Giuseppe, which he became Joe. and his second oldest son was Giuliano, who became Julian. And they Americanized. My grandfather continued, or my grandfather started peddling as soon as he came here. I think he was 12 and peddling lemons and oranges to the bars up and down High Street. His dad would give him a big knapsack and he'd carry him. Now you got to realize his Army discharge paper said he was 5'3.5", 160 pounds.
All right. From what I understand, it was my grandfather that things were very rough in Italy, where he was from, which was from Calabria, which is the tip of the boot of the beautiful shape of Italy. And he was the first of his family in Italy to come to America. And we're looking at the year about 1916, something to that effect. And he came over to, like so many, he was a little bit older person. At that time, he wasn't a child. He was like late teens, early 20s. And looked how everything would be in America, what it would be like. And he started to search what his jobs would be so that he could send money back home. And then later on, the entire family, his brother and other members of the family came to America. That was my fraternal father's grandfather, or my fraternal father's father. On my mother's side, it was interesting because my grandparents were born in Columbus, Ohio. So my great-grandparents, again from the Abruzzi region, Guadraiege, were one of the, and Tradacqua, those are the areas my grandparents were from. But my grandparents and my mother and father born here. So that's kind of cool. So I'm second generation on one side and third generation on another. And again, it was that whole financial problems that were happening. And so they came here and looked for work. When I said about here, my grandfather on my fraternal side actually went to Lynch, Kentucky, and was a coal miner. Interesting enough, we're watching WOSU back in the 90s. They have this wonderful vintage show about the coal miners. And there's my grandfather in this picture. He had been dead some 40 years by that time, and there he was. So that was pretty shocking and exciting to see. But he was the fabric of the Italian community and the first one. My other side, they were the Central Market. They were the fruit people. Central Market, North Market is where my grandmother sold bananas. My family had fruit stands, and my grandfather, seeing all this, decided he was going to work in a bakery as a very small boy, and ended up having one of the largest bakeries at that time, Seymour Bakery, Giantonio's, in Columbus, Ohio. So just cool things that would happen in your family.
Both grandparents came over at the turn of the century. My grandfathers both came first and then brought their families over after they earned money to bring them over. My paternal grandfather was an orphan, so there wasn't a whole lot of history that we could track down on him. And his wife, my grandmother, passed away right after they immigrated to Columbus. My maternal grandparents were from Sicily, and in talking with Grandpa many times, in his broken English, he would tell me that the reason they came to the United States was that their town, their village was so poor in the mountains near Palermo that they ate dirt, were his words. So he came here for a better life for his family. Mom's parents ended up living with Mom as she was the youngest of 7 children, and in an Italian home, she would be responsible for taking care of her parents and make them comfortable. So I grew up with them in the same house.
On my side, my maternal grandparents both immigrated to the United States from Italy. My grandfather, he came from the Abruzzo region of Italy, and my grandmother from Tuscany. My grandmother had previously married and lived in the Marble Cliff area around the quarry, and her husband was killed in a quarry accident. So later she met my grandfather, and his last name was DeSantis of the flower businesses in and around Columbus. And he was the first of his brothers to come to the United States. And many times they would come over, and he originally was coming to the wine country of California and was going to go out and work in a vineyard. And as they only had enough money to get into the United States and then start to work their way across the country. So he stopped in a few places, and he knew some people from Abruzzo that were in Columbus, and he ended up stopping in Columbus and worked for a landscape company. And in that, he learned the business, enjoyed it, and he started Linden Florist, which was in the predominantly Italian area of Columbus at that time. And he enabled his brothers to come over. Nick opened up DeSantis Florist on High Street in the Clintonville area, and his brother Pat opened up DeSantis Florist on Henderson Road. On my father's side, my grandfather was from Alvito, which was just south of Rome. And he immigrated originally with his father to England. And then from England, they came over to the United States. And it was the same type of thing. They ended up in Columbus quite by accident. There were so many people from Alvito already here, and they all got in the construction business. So you had the Sinicola family, the Guzzo family, the Gallucci's, the Tatas, the Aramos, and the Connies. And much of the infrastructure that's in Columbus today, typically your sewage or your water is all from pipes that they installed 100 years ago, which is kind of neat. They came over primarily because the economy was so bad. You just had the Great Depression here in the United States, and it trickled over into Europe. They came for a better life, and they were also trying to escape the fascism and socialism that was taking place there in Europe at that time, and predominantly Italy and Germany.
Again, I know more about my mother's side because we lived with her parents. Grandpa would always tell me about the stories. First of all, both grandfathers worked for the railroad. There were pockets in central Ohio where the Italians ended up congregating. One was at the railroad yards in the Milo Grogan area, which was a block from our house. The other were, as Jack said, the quarries on the west side of Columbus. And there was a third area called the Flytown near St. Francis, which is now St. Francis off of Buttles Avenue. So in those areas, when Grandpa first got here and was looking for employment, he ended up with the railroad. He did not know English, of course, so they gave him the job of stenciling the numbers on the boxcars. My dad's dad had a little bit of woodworking skills, and he ended up replacing the floorboards in the refrigerator cars, which were always rotting out because of the moisture, the water from the ice, and what have you. So they both worked on the railroad.
We always had, the big holiday meals, and I guess about 30 years ago, so I was probably still in college, I sat down with my grandmother and actually cooked with her and learned all of her recipes and documented all the recipes. So I actually have those today, and I'll have Thanksgiving at my house and I'll cook, and any other times I can get my kids to come back to Ohio, I'll cook the meal for everybody. And I've kind of done the same thing with my kids. I won't give them the recipes. They have to sit there and cook with me. So now they have them, they've learned them. I have had cousins reach out and want some pizzelles, which is an Italian cookie. My grandmother's recipe was the best. And I'll actually ask them how much they want to make and make it for them and give it to them because they haven't sat down with me to learn the recipe. So that was always special. The meals, just going to church on Sundays, because as a young person, I went to St. John's with my mom and dad and my brother. We did catechism classes there, and it was always an event because The Mass was beautiful. Father Maripez, who said the Mass, gave amazing homilies. And then there was such a family unity within the parish itself. You would go down into the basement after Mass, and the parents would typically have coffee and donuts while the kids were at their classes. And just walking back at that time to get a cup of coffee, the men would go into this little room with a curtain that was drawn, and it was strictly the men that were allowed in there. They would put some money into a little cigar box, and there would be a little bit of liquor, and you'd pour a shot into your coffee. And it was like a scene out of The Sopranos. And it was just, those were just great memories. And the other thing I can remember too is the creation of the Columbus Italian Festival. My father was very, very active in the parish. He was a past chairman, as you were. And, that when that came around in October at that time, it was a big 2-week project. And everybody that was in the construction business, Italians in Central Ohio, donated their equipment or their crews to go over and get everything set up. At the time, I think it was in the Lauschie building on the fairgrounds. And so just to be able to see that grow to become the event that it is today and how it contributes to Columbus. I mean, there's so many people that come in from all over the country just for that event. And they'll be at church on Sundays at St. John's because of that.
And I'm going to go back to kind of the history of St. John the Baptist Italian Catholic Church, why that was so special. That's kind of the centerpiece, as far as I'm concerned, on the Italian population in Columbus, Ohio. John Marzetti, who was not the Marzetti dressing, but the Marzetti food, the Johnny Marzetti, that was him. He was a realtor and had purchased much land all over the city of Columbus, including where St. John the Baptist is currently. His way to incorporate the Italian population was to give them this land so they could build a church. Because before that, the Italians coming to this country actually went to the cathedral, St. Joseph Cathedral, still there, beautifully sandblasted about 5 years ago. And they would pray under the once baptistry, and it was the picture of St. John the Baptist on the stained glass window, gorgeously done. And the Italians some of them would come and live in the church. They would hide and abide, and that was their dwelling. They had nowhere else to go. And the Catholic Church was welcoming. So with that love of St. John the Baptist and with that love of the Italian community, now people are getting to know one another. John Marzetti gave the land to build the church, and the Italians built the church themselves. There was no hired construction. So everyone got together and put that church on the map. So that was the beginning of the relationships. And again, you have so many coming from their own regions. As I said, the Abruzzi region, the Calabria regions, various areas that make you proud. And they're like little states, no different than if you're going from Alabama, Georgia, Maine, whatever. It's the same idea. And you have that pride. And that's what's so beautiful even now at St. John the Baptist. Tends to be a little bit more Introdacqua, Abruzzi region. There's many others, but that's kind of the home of it. And that's really where the relationships have stepped. I have 2 grandfathers. One would be considered an artist because he did ironwork around the city, still standing today. When he came to this town on Glenwood Avenue, he put together a iron workshop, and he and my dad worked there. My dad, after high school at Aquinas High School, would go into work there. My grandfather would be there. And we're going to get into how that was so important soon, how that fit into the city of Columbus. My other grandfather, as you mentioned earlier, was the fruit. 9 years old, he quit school, works. 16 years old, he is opening his first bakery, 16, 17 years old. Now, what 17-year-old is going to do that? Going to go to bed every night and get up early at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and bake, and maybe with one other person. So he learned this trade and then went ahead and put together this bakery. So the tradition was in the small villages, on the wedding days, they would have what was called the Grand March. And there was a particular march. You see a little bit of it in The Godfather, kind of a beautiful part of The Godfather is just gorgeous. It's so true. But they would have a march. And my grandfather brought that to America from his father, and made that happen in Columbus. At those early days, my grandfather was known as the Grand March King. All the Italians would come to our bakery to get the wedding cake that was decorated by my uncle and my grandfather. And then later my dad kind of played both sides. He was working for his father, married my mother, daughter of the bakery, and my dad got into doing all the cake decorating, again, making those wonderful cakes. So that's part of the tradition. My grandfather, being the artist in Italy, then also came here to do gorgeous ironwork and brought that talent to the city of Columbus, as well as music. My grandfather, Joseph Masdea, was a musician in Italy, a trumpet player. And he came here to America, noticed in Columbus, Ohio, there wasn't a municipal band like there would be the small band we mentioned at the marching down the wedding path in The Godfather. So he put together a band here in Columbus, and that was the Columbus Municipal Band. And they would play at Goodale Park every Sunday. They would play for events, St. John the Baptist Catholic Church. So I have the wedding side and I have the music side. So it put together this kind of beautiful celebration, because the Italians are celebrators. They are love of love. They love of people. To villainize us and to look at Christopher the way they have, you have to understand our history. You have to understand what Christopher was about. And the religion is a key point with Christopher Columbus.
The District of Columbia, when you hear Columbia is the feminine version of Columbus. So the District of Columbia, the city's named after Columbus. The World's Fair in Chicago in 1892, the World's Columbian Exposition was celebrating.
The United States was almost called Columbia.
Yes, it was.
There was a movement back in the 18th century when we were getting set up. There were a number of people who wanted to call it Columbia.
So, that idea of Columbus being a celebrated figure in American history became an opportunity for Italian Americans. Even though he sailed for Spain, he was from Genoa. He was an Italian explorer. And having somebody who was seen as a hero be also Italian, and you can see if there was discrimination and a lot of this was going on, that would be an opportunity to feel more American, or to maybe be seen as more American because of that connection. Some of the Columbus Day, one of the first celebrations was in New York and San Francisco, that had large Italian populations back 1860s, 1870s. There was a terrible episode in New Orleans that had quite a few Italian immigrants, where there was a lynching after a murder. And even the New York Times had an editorial about how shifty they were. And I mean, it was just, you read some of this today and you understand how horrible that must have felt to read something like that. And yet, we respect the New York Times today. And I was kind of shocked to read that. So that was one of the first sanctioned celebrations, because it was 1892. So that 1492, those 92 years become, marking points.
Well, then you have the whole thing with the organized crime, Elliot Ness fighting the Italian mob in Chicago and that sort of thing. There's a lot of myth that swirls around, a lot of assumption about what Italian Americans are up to, that sort of thing. I guess it comes with any group you're not familiar with. You sort of make assumptions about people that aren't necessarily, and usually are simply not true.
I think it was something that embarrassed me growing up, that everybody thought if you were Italian, you had to be mafia. And it was like, stereotypes die hard. Even today, on television, that happens. But going back to the idea of Christopher Columbus. So the period of 1955, it was so different in the United States than it was in Italy at that time. We were the victors in World War II. War did not take place on our soil, on our land. We didn't see destruction that happened, and displacement, and just what people suffered and went through. Italy was just recovering from the war in 1955, and here we were. We had a booming economy at that time. We had a population boom at that time. We had suburbs being built. That was not the case in much of Europe. And during the war, Italy suffered tremendously from bombing, first from Allied forces invading Italy, later by retreating Germans who were, after the liberation, they really extracted a lot of pain as they left. They did not leave willingly. But what was interesting was by the time Italy was liberated in 1944, they welcomed the Allies. They wanted to be out from under a fascist Mussolini government. They saw where it led, and that kind of changed attitudes about it. But probably the defining thing that this country did at the end of World War II that I don't think had ever been done in history was the idea of the Marshall Plan, where we as a country actually invested what today would be many billions of dollars in rebuilding countries. Most of the money went to Germany, Italy, and France to actually help them rebuild. But to help rebuild the country of your former enemy was unprecedented. Instead of claiming land, we actually helped. And in Italy, between about 1948 and 1952, there were about 15,000 projects in Italy funded by American dollars. And it helped to rebuild the infrastructure, reinvest in the railroads and roads. And one of the biggest things, because it really impacted people in rural areas, was tractor sales. And this sounds like nothing, so we sold tractors. Agriculture was 19th century agriculture, even at the start of World War II. They didn't have machinery. It wasn't updated. It wasn't as productive as it could be. So the investment really impacted people no matter where they lived. It was rural areas, it was cities, it was transportation. And the idea that the city, Genoa, and this idea that there's a city named Columbus in the U.S. and that opportunity to have a people-to-people kind of relationship was something that Sister Cities was really promoting. And Genoa became Columbus's first sister city in 1955. But in looking at this a little more carefully, it was interesting to see at the time Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and he was very supportive of any people-to-people kind of activity, whatever it was, program activity, because he really believed if people reached out across borders to try to understand a culture or a different people, that we would be less inclined to want to go to war. History will maybe prove that it hasn't been as successful as one would hope, but I think there was a sense of optimism, a sense of relief that the war was over and it worked out the way that it did, and I think a sense of being grateful. So the idea of a gift to a city, and that it was a big deal in this city, and you can imagine those 30 Italian-American organizations who were involved in the celebration. It was a multi-day celebration, how they finally felt like they were, they were really assimilated now because this great thing was happening and 100,000 people attended it. It's easy to understand why people were proud of that. We know so much more about Columbus today than we did then. And I think your experience and your history and your culture could look at that through a different lens. And I think that the thing about history is the more we learn, the more we have an opportunity to understand. And understanding where it came from and how people might look at it today might be a challenge, but it's also it also could move us forward into understanding different viewpoints and different experiences. I can speak to my experience. I can't speak to anybody else's, and it's interesting to hear other people tell their stories of their families or their traditions or their their grandparents, great-grandparents, forefathers, whatever. I think Italian-American heritage is still alive and well in Columbus. It might be different than it was in 1920, I think it's still alive and well in families, in community. There's still organizations that celebrate that heritage. I think the Italian Festival, and I don't remember exactly when it started, it was in the 1980s, but the Italian Festival, I know people today who still go, and we know young people who are still learning traditional dances, and they celebrate. It's like, Irish dancing or, Oktoberfest or whatever. So I think people are proud. They're proud to be Americans. They're proud to be Italian Americans. And I think it's that aspect of it that they're both. And especially later generations. There are probably still people coming. In fact, we do know some Italians living here in Columbus who came for work, highly, doctors and people in chemical working for Columbus companies. They're highly educated, but they love being in Columbus. And they're still Italian citizens, but they have pretty much moved here permanently. I don't know that they go back. Their children are bilingual, they're bicultural. I think it is something that's still a part of our city and will continue to be forever.